Well, with that bodhicitta motivation, we can do the verse of refuge in bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. To the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. To the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. To the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Good to see everybody. And today we, with last class, we sort of completed the section of the text on the second of the four sections, right? The section on the Sautantrikas. And so today we start the third of the four sections of this text, which is on the Chittamatra, or mind-only school. For those who have the text and are following along, it's page 15 that we're up to where that starts. So the mind-only or Chittamatra school. And one thing I'll point out is, so like, now we're up to, right, there are two remaining tenet systems, I'll call them, right? So one is the Chittamatra and then the Madhyamaka. And those are, those come from the Mahayana, right? The former two came from the vehicle of individual liberation, right? And then these next two come from, the texts and philosophers of the great vehicle, Mahayana. And again, it's covered in 7 points, the same 7 points, right? Like, so every chapter has the same structure. Each school is covered in 7 points. So these will be the same 7 points to cover it. And because there's something else to say by way of introduction, like the mind-only, actually the mind-only school and the Madhyamaka school are both, like, I was thinking about this, they're like whole, they're huge topics. And, and so this, I guess I'll just say, this is obviously, like, this text is a, really, I said this at the very beginning of our study, this text by Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen. Jetsun Chogi Gyaltsen wrote the textbooks, right, for Sarah J Monastery. And so this is actually that, really, this is like a, introductory textbook, one of the introduction that they would use for studying tenets. They would spend years then going into detail about different tenet systems and so on. But, so we're not going to, obviously this, I was thinking that, like, this whole text is like that, right? It's covering all 4 tenet systems. And then, there are huge texts just on the mind-only school, right? Many, like, big, thick, humongous texts just studying the mind-only school alone. And then, of course, Madhyamaka, same thing. I remember thinking that once when, like, Jeffrey Hopkins, Professor Hopkins, he had published, long before that, he had published, like, Meditation on Emptiness and various other, like, major texts on Madhyamaka. And then he published a 3-volume set on the mind-only school. And I was like, wow, he's a studier, he's obviously a proponent of Madhyamaka, but he published like 3 big, thick books, a series on the mind-only school. And I was like, raising difficult philosophical points. And so I was sort of thinking back to those texts and thinking, well, okay, obviously we're not going to cover that level of detail, of course, because it's a huge topic. But anyway, even to cover the level we're going to cover those, I was like, oh, it takes, actually studying Buddhist philosophy takes, I was like, you have to be a little bit intrepid, right? A little bit brave to study Buddhist philosophy. Because it's actually, what's Buddhist philosophy doing? It's actually challenging your sense of it's challenging our sense of how we perceive ourselves and our world, isn't it? So it takes some bravery to study that because you're actually challenging your own assumptions, own ways of perceiving, and all that. So anyway. So the mind-only school, right? So it starts the mind-only school. The explanation of the mind-only school, Chittamatra, has 7 outlines as before. So I already mentioned that's the same structure. And then the first is always definition. And actually, I wanted to share something about this. Oh, there it is. I was sort of reflecting on something. So I'm just doing this, I'm just mentioning this as a point of interest for a second. Is, like I said, so this is a Sarah J's textbook, right, for studying Introduction to Tenets. And then I was looking. So when I prepare for these classes, I've been using 3 different Geshe's commentaries to this text. But then I also look at other sources to compare and contrast, like Jeffrey Hopkins' books, and here's one. So I was looking yesterday at one I really like. He was one of my teachers. He passed away. Geshe Sopa from University of, he taught at University of Wisconsin and lived in Wisconsin for many years. He was Lama Zopa Rinpoche's teacher. Anyway, he passed away some years ago, but it's interesting. He was from Sarah J, but he published in this book, Cutting Through Appearances. He, together with Jeffrey Hopkins, published a commentary on Tenets that's based on the same, an introductory textbook, but from Drepung by Guncho Jigme Wangpo. So it's interesting here, he was a Sarah J Lama, but he used, in this publication, I think it's Jeffrey Hopkins like Drepung, so they worked together on a text from Drepung. But anyway, he gives a different definition. So I want to compare the two just for fun, like some strange version of fun, right? But my point is that I'm just sharing that to say, even different Gelugpa monasteries will give different definitions of things, right? And then the reason I'm mentioning that is then you can imagine, right? Because how do the monks study? They debate, right? So that makes it interesting, isn't it? So if a Drepung monk and a Sarah J monk start to debate, they'll say, well, what's the definition of a mind-only school person? And then they can even debate what's the definition of that, right? And ultimately, in the essence, they agree, but they raise these different emphases as a way of thinking about it. Does that make sense? That's why, so they'll give different details or different slight differences in their focus to get you to think. And that's the idea, isn't it? So, okay, so our definition from our text is, the definition of a proponent of mind only is a person propounding great vehicle tenets who does not accept external objects, but does assert truly established self-knowers, right? So we'll go through the parts. Actually, maybe before I do that, I'm just going to read the definition from Guncho Jigme Wangpo to compare it. He says the definition of a proponent of mind only, right? So that's the same beginning, but now it's different. He says a person propounding Buddhist tenets who asserts the true existence of other powered natures, but does not assert external objects. So it's interesting, he doesn't mention self-knowers, right? And he says they do assert the true existence of other powered natures, which our text doesn't mention. And the one thing they agree on is do not assert external objects. So it's a slightly different definition. And anyway, I'm not going to cover his definition in detail. We'll get to other powered natures and what that is as we go on into the text further. Our text will cover what are other powered natures, but it doesn't mention it in the definition. Is it different? But okay, so going back to our text. The definition of a proponent of mind only, a person. So first of all, like I said, propounding great vehicle tenets means this is from the Mahayana, right? It's a Mahayana tenet system, and they often say that you'll hear this phrase sometimes where they talk about the 2 great trailblazers, right? And you'll hear that in Tibetan Buddhism often. And when they say 2 great trailblazers of the Mahayana, they're referring to Nagarjuna was the trailblazer, right? Meaning like he opened the system of study of Madhyamaka. And then Asanga was the trailblazer who opened the system of study of mind only, they say sometimes. So anyways, one of the 2 great Mahayana tenet systems, and the trailblazer, they say sometimes, who opened the study of this was Asanga, Arya Asanga. So great vehicle tenets, now it says, who does not accept external objects. So we're going to get into what that means, right? They do not accept external objects, is the way they say it here, but does assert truly established self-knowers. So remember self-knowers, they were, which other school accepts self-knowers that we've covered so far, right? It was the Sautantrikas, right? The Vaibhashikas do not accept self-knowers, but the Sautantrikas do accept self-knowers, and he's saying that part of the definition of mind-only school is that they assert truly established self-knowers. And the implication there of truly established is that it's implying something, which is that one is so self-knowers, right? We said that self-knowers are part of how these philosophers would say people remember things, right? Is they're aware of having experienced them, right? So that there's an aspect of mind that is self-knowing and therefore can be remembered. But they say truly established. And the implication there is that for followers of the mind-only school, mind is truly established, right? Or is truly existent. So self-knowers are truly established or truly existent. For those, all of you, I think, have had some exposure to Madhyamaka, and that'll be a point that Madhyamakas would disagree with. But it's okay, and so we'll get into detail about what do they mean by do not accept external objects. We'll get into that as we go along. And then it says, so proponent of mind only, Chittamadrin, proponent of cognition, and yogic practitioner are equivalent. So they're saying those are three synonyms for this school, like three labels like for the same school. And particularly sometimes you'll hear yogic practitioner or yogacara used. That's a commonly used phrase. The Chittamatrins are often used, but yogacara are also often used. And Gelugpa lamas will say those are synonyms. Not all, I'll just say that not, I think, who was it? Yeah, Gelugpa lamas will all say that those are synonyms, but there are some, I think, some Nyingma lamas will say those are slightly different, so I'm not sure. I haven't studied why they say that, but I have noticed that. But Gelugpas will say those are synonyms. Okay, so that's the definition. Then we can go on to the divisions of the Chittamatrins. And one thing I'll just mention, that because this text doesn't mention it, but it's okay to mention, I think. Many other textbooks or summaries of the mind-only school will mention a different way of dividing Chittamatra school. So I'll just mention it very briefly, but I won't go into it. One way of dividing that's not mentioned here, the Chittamatra school, is into followers of scripture and followers of reasoning. And so if you were to divide them that way, the Chittamatrins who follow scripture would be those who rely mainly on the texts of Asanga, of Arya Asanga, and those who came directly after him. Whereas those who follow, Chittamatrins who follow reasoning would mainly be followers of Dharmakirti and the texts, and his texts and the texts of those who came after him. So one way of dividing Chittamatras that's not mentioned here is followers of scripture, who kind of tend to follow Asanga's approach to mind only, and then followers of reasoning who tend to follow Dharmakirti. Because Dharmakirti was considered great master of reasoning and logic. So that. But anyway, that's not mentioned here. So we'll go into what's mentioned here. So this says there are two divisions. And so this text is going to mainly focus on these two divisions for this whole section, and then talk about the subdivisions of them. So the two divisions are mind-only true aspectarians and mind-only false aspectarians. And I guess before I'm trying to think where to jump in here, maybe I'll say something. So aspectarian, the word aspectarian is kind of a funny English word, I think. Maybe I'll say, so it may be useful to pause there, so I was sort of thinking about it, and to say, what is aspect? And so aspect here are gross, coarse objects appearing to direct perceivers of ordinary beings. So what it means, actually, it's an interesting point. I'll just sort of reflect on for a minute. And I want to say something in general as we go on now in this, just to look at this idea of divisions, right? You could say, well, it's just divisions. It's just like, but it presents some interesting ideas that I want to sort of not go into humongous detail, but go into a little detail about, because, you know, in Buddhism, these kinds of, you could, I don't want to say it that way. There's like a danger in a way to just sort of take this as like, oh, okay, this is a label of this school and that school. But that's not the point. The point is that all, as you'll see as we go into these details of these different sub schools, that they're getting at how do you perceive. Does that make sense? How do you perceive things? How does your mind work, right? And the mind only school is really good at sort of exploring how does mind work. Actually, even in the Lamrim, if you look at, when you look in the Lamrim, you'll notice that when they get to like, how do you develop calm abiding? Like in Tsongkhapa's great treatise on the stages of the path, and middle length treatise on the stages of the path. When he gets to the section on how do you develop calm abiding, you'll see he very, very often quotes Asanga, Arya Asanga, right? Because Arya Asanga's texts go into great detail about how do you develop calm abiding. And so anyway, my point is that mind-only texts are very good at describing how mind works and how mind functions. And so one point that they get at is aspects, right? So things, and actually it's an interesting point, right? So when you perceive an object, right, what it's getting at is your mind takes on the aspect of the object, right? Like, so when you say the object appears to your mind, right? So your mind takes on the aspect of the object. And so, yeah. And we'll sort of explore as we go on, what does that mean, right? And I'm just going to read actually the two definitions of these two sub-schools, the main big definitions, and I'm going to pause and sort of talk about them. So, right, so we said there are two divisions according to this way of dividing: mind-only true aspectarians and mind-only false aspectarians. So I'm going to read this definition, which I think is hard to understand, to be honest, and then we'll get into what it means. The definition of mind-only true aspectarian is a proponent of mind-only who asserts that a direct perceiver apprehending form in the continuum of an ordinary being does not engage, polluted by the latencies of ignorance, in a factor of its appearance as a gross form. And the definition of mind-only false aspectarian is a proponent of mind-only who asserts that a direct perceiver apprehending form in the continuum of an ordinary being does engage, polluted by the latency of ignorance, in the factor of its appearance as a gross form. Actually, those are like, did anybody when hearing that say, oh, now I understand? Like immediately the meaning appears to your mind. It's quite difficult, isn't it? And actually, oops, take out a couple different texts to kind of get into the details of what this is getting at. So what this is getting at is this, is when they're saying, so first of all, they're talking about what they're addressing. They both have the same, in their definitions, they're both getting, they both raise the same point about something. So I'll say what it is. So they're talking about in the continuum of an ordinary being. So that's us. All of us are, or, you know, we're talking about non-Aryas, right? It's people who have not seen emptiness directly. An ordinary person, or ordinary, not just people, animals too, and other kinds of beings. So they're talking about in the continuum, meaning in the mental continuum of an ordinary, I'm going to say being, right, person, when they're directly perceiving something, right? So they're talking, you see where it says here, a direct perceiver apprehending form in the continuum of an ordinary being. So first of all, I just want to, that's the context. So we're talking about an ordinary being who's perceiving form, right? Directly, a direct perception. So this is like what they're getting at there. I just want to pause. What they're getting at there is everyday ordinary experience, right? In other words, this is what they're getting at, like what happens all the time. You go outside and you see the sidewalk, or, you know, you look at your cup of coffee, whatever. Like there's a direct perceiver of an ordinary being. You look up and you see your cup of coffee. That's a direct perception of an ordinary being. You know, you, whatever, putting on your shirt, you're an ordinary being and you have a direct perception of the shirt, and then you reach out and touch it. You know, so they're getting a very ordinary day-to-day thing here. And now what they're getting at though is this, is so when that, so they're getting at, so something appears to you, right? And so first of all, in terms of aspectarian, as I was saying, like the aspect is what appears to your consciousness, right? So an aspect of something appears to your consciousness. And there are a number of factors here that this school is going to start to address. One is, and I want to say, first of all, so true aspectarians and false aspectarians, right? I want to first point out something they agree on, and then I'm going to point out where they disagree. So they both agree that an aspect appears to the mind, right? And they both agree that what appears to the mind is an appearance of something existing externally, right? External object, right? We're talking about form here, right? So there is that, and it's just very simple, right? Like if I look and see a cup, right? What's appearing to my mind is cup, or it's appearing to me, to my direct, if it's my eyes, is a cup that appears to exist externally, external to the mind. And both true aspectarians and false aspectarians, because they're mind only, according to the definition we just gave, right? Mind, what was the part of the definition was mind only followers do not accept external objects, right? So both true aspectarians and false aspectarians would say there's something mistaken in my perception of cup, which is that I'm perceiving it as something external, but it doesn't exist that way. Up to that point, does that make sense? That's what these philosophers are asserting. And they agree on that point. Now comes a different point, right? Which is, so they would both agree that this aspect of it appearing externally is a false appearance, a mistaken appearance. But now they're going to raise a different question, which is, in the case of, I'm going to use the cup as the example, right? So it's like a gray cup. Right? So they would say, so they both would agree that its appearance as an external thing is false. But now they're going to raise a different question. These are Buddhist philosophers, right? So they're saying, well, wait a second, okay, that's wrong. But they're raising a philosophical question here, and this is where it says here, polluted by the latencies of ignorance, right? That's in these two different phrases. So here's the issue they're trying to raise. So when you see the cup, though, perceiving it, let's see this right, its appearance as gray is that, like, so the fact that it appears externally is polluted by ignorance, right? Because it doesn't really exist externally. But now they're raising a different question. They're saying, does experience it as gray and experiencing it as a form, are those polluted by ignorance, or are those unpolluted, accurate perceptions? Right? So perceiving something gray as gray, is that polluted by ignorance, or is that just correct? Right? And perceiving a form, leaving out the external part, which is wrong, perceiving form as form, is that polluted by ignorance, or is that correct? That's the question these two sub-schools are asking. And so for true aspectarians, they would say those aspects of direct perceivers are not polluted by the latencies of ignorance. In other words, they would say that perceiving it as external is mistaken, but perceiving gray is not polluted by ignorance, it's correct. And perceiving form as form is not polluted by ignorance, it's correct. And then from their perspective, that's part of how they can sustain valid cognition, is like things, in other words, there's an element of error in the external, in perceiving it as external, but they would assert that those parts of perception are not polluted by ignorance, because perceiving gray as reasonable, is correct, and perceiving forms as correct. False aspectarians, on the other hand, would say, no, all of that is, all those elements of perception are tainted by the imprints of ignorance, or polluted by the imprints of ignorance. And so the aspect, that's why false aspect, right? False aspectarian. So the entire aspect of what appears to your mind is tainted by ignorance and is false. That's a general explanation of the difference between these two. So it's really getting at, right, there's an aspect that appears to your mind, right? In this case, whatever, I used the example of a gray cup, right? And so what they're getting at is, again, I'm just going to summarize it, right? They both agree that this aspect of it that the aspect appears to be external to the mind. They would both, because they're mind-only followers, would say that's incorrect. Where they disagree with each other, these two subschools, is the one, right? The true aspectarians say, but the grayness and that it's an object or a form is not tainted by ignorance, so it's correct. Whereas the false aspectarians say the entire perception is false, is incorrect. Now, I want to sort of say a little more about it, because there's another part of this definition where you're talking about gross form. They use this term gross form, right? And so I want to raise some, actually, it was interesting. I was looking through the text and there were different definitions. I was looking, well, what does gross form mean? Right? And two different texts, actually, two different commentaries gave different explanations, which often happens. One talked about, subtle form being like particles and gross form being like a gross object. So that's one way of looking at that term, gross form. But there was another text that raised some interesting philosophical points, so I always want to raise them to you to contemplate. And they were getting at this. So they were saying that this Geshe was saying his definition, or his way of looking at that, was that gross form, he was saying, is, did he say it? Okay, this is what he was getting. Gross form, this was his definition. Gross form is the common perception of cup. And then there's the subtle form, is the person's individual sort of perception of cup. And what he was getting at, he was starting to raise some interesting issues that are core to the mind-only school. So I just want to get into them just a little bit here, right? Which is, it's getting at some, I should say this the right way. Okay. So how can, what he's getting is this, is how is it that we, like, I held up an object and said cup, right? And so what the mind-only school is starting to raise is there a common, like, in other words, if I do this, cup, right? Everybody can kind of go, okay, cup, it's a cup. And yet, if you pause to think about it, this is where he said that I guess you were saying subtle form is where you start to recognize your own perception of cup, right? And that each person has a different aspect to their own internal mental experience of cup. Right? So like, and actually it's true if you pause to think about it, right? Like, so say, think of like a cup in your home, right? So like one person might think, oh, like one person looks at that cup and maybe thinks, oh, um, you know, my relative gave me that cup, and I uh, love that relative. So just when I drink out of that cup, I have this feeling of closeness to that person, and I'm really happy to see that cup. Somebody else looks at that cup and thinks, oh, his relative gave that cup, and they're so annoying. I just see that cup, and I wish I could throw it out. But then he'd be upset, and I shouldn't throw it out. Maybe I could drop it and break it, but whatever. Uh, and somebody else might look at that cup and think it's just kind of an ugly cup or something, right? Like everybody's mental aspect of the cup is different. So that mental aspect of the cup then is mental, right? Or the mental the that which arises to a consciousness is unique to that consciousness, right? That makes sense, doesn't it? So is there, I'm pausing just to ask you then. So if everybody has a different aspect to their consciousness, this is sort of the mind-only school. Well, one thing the mind-only school would say then, so is there something external to consciousness then? That's what they're starting, that's already being starting, it's implied here in this issue of aspect. Right? And another thing, and this is what Geshe Sopa in his commentaries that starts to raise, is he starts to say, well, let's see gross, if that Geshe was getting at the gross aspect is a common aspect, right? Well, what does that even mean? Right? That there's something common between people about the cup. And in a way, there is something common, right? We say we can all agree maybe a cup is a cup. Although, as one of the commentaries pointed out, well, somebody might use a cup as a ladle, right? So then they would say, oh no, I use that as a ladle. That's what I use to serve my soup or something. We put it aside just for that purpose. So then somebody might say, well, it's a cup, and somebody else might say it's a ladle, for example. To their consciousness, it would appear as a different thing, right? And those are just humans, right? Then this school starts to get at, then non-humans perceive it quite differently than humans, don't they? Right? A non-human might perceive the same, like actually, if you put the cup over an insect that's crawling across your floor to carry it outside, then the insect's not going to perceive it as cup, right? They're going to perceive it as what? Like, I don't know, what? A trap? Potentially a predator, maybe? They're going to think it's something attacking them, right? So this school is getting at like these questions, right? And so is there something, right? So this issue of false aspectarian and true aspectarian is asking a question in a way. Is there something that you perceive that's untainted by the imprints of ignorance, that's somehow objectively existent? And what, so actually, if you think about this school, right, so the true aspectarians are saying, yes, that there's something about perception or experience where the aspect is untainted by ignorance. There's some aspect of our perceptions that's not tainted by ignorance. The false aspectarians actually are saying, no, because we always, whatever we perceive, first of all, as external and as being what it is, right, is not, let's see, say it right, doesn't have any objective truth to it. So they're two different, so these are two different philosophical positions among mind-only followers. Um, and I'll say today, actually, I'll read a couple of other. I'll just read a couple of quotes here that I wrote down, just my own summaries. So at one point, one Geshe says, the gross aspect of cup is a common or shared experience of the cup as a cup, or a person as a person. The subtle aspect is each individual's unique experience of that cup or person. And Ken Rinpoche Geshe Tupten Choni, the abbot of Kopang, says, for true aspectarians, that gross aspect is something that actually exists. Right? That there is a gross aspect that's a common shared experience. Whereas he says false aspectarians, they do not assert that that exists, actually. And there is no gross aspect, actually, that exists. There is nothing that's a common shared experience. There's just each individual's unique experience. Right? That's the result of their karma. And sometimes beings have similar karma, so they have similar experiences and they can sort of communicate about that. But there is no, that for false aspectarians, there is no common shared experience. There are just individual moments of cognition. You know, and these false aspectarians and true aspectarians are differing with each other on whether that gross aspect is a result of pollutions or, false aspectarians would say it's a result of the pollution of ignorance and it's not actually existent, whereas true aspectarians would say no, that it is existent. I'll make a couple of points. Like one Geshe pointed out, which I agree with him, that for true aspectarians, you can see why they would want to assert that there is some shared experience, some untainted by ignorance thing that's perceived, because it's a way of staying farther away from nihilism. But as he points out, once you assert that there's a common shared experience, it becomes very difficult then to sustain that there's no external object. And so if so I think this is my own opinion now, is that it seems to me, and this is what this Geshe was saying, I agree with him, that false aspectarians seem more, I don't know what the word is, more fully mind only or something. That their argument, I think, is more. It would be more, well, you could see Dharmakirti would be an example. It would be harder to debate against from their, from a mind only perspective. Now, another point they make is, if form did exist externally, right? If cups, this is an argument from the mind only school. If cups exist externally, then everyone's perception of the cup should be the same, right? Because it's truly what's perceived. But everyone's perception of any given cup is not the same, right? And therefore, things don't exist independent or separate from mind, is one of their arguments. And then I actually want to go back now and just say a few more general points before I go on, just because I think it helps orient us. So what does it mean right now? I mean, you get the idea. And I think that covers this general point of what are true aspectarian, mind only true aspectarians and mind only false aspectarians. I want to say a couple more general points now, because I think we've raised them already. And about one point I want to make, which I liked, is that, let me just say this, because as sort of people who may have had some exposure to other non-Buddhist philosophy, mind-only school followers are not solipsistic. They're not saying everything is only your mind, right? Mind-only followers are Mahayanists, right? We said Mahayana tenet system. So they believe they're limitless sentient beings, right? Who suffer and who are worthy of compassion and so on. So, so one point is they're not solipsistic. They're not just saying like, oh, everything's your mind and nothing exists at all, right? They're saying there are countless beings who each have mind and who suffer and who, and that your task is to become a Buddha and to enlighten others and liberate them from suffering. So that's one general point. And then in terms of like, in the definition, right, it said, do not accept external objects. I want to make a point about that too, just as a little subtle distinction, but we're going to get into it more, is the mind-only school, you often use different metaphors and similes, right? And yeah. And so one is like a dream, right? In other words, and I want to just briefly comment on that, so like a general way that they sometimes say it is that objects appear in dreams, right? You could experience a mountain in a dream. And then when you wake up, you can understand there's no external, that mountain you saw in your dream doesn't exist externally, right? And so they make the point, things can appear to exist externally, but not actually exist externally. That's one point. Another is, if in the dream you're trying to climb the mountain, right, you might suffer. You might if you had a bad dream of a mountain climb, you might suffer in your dream from trying to climb some giant mountain. Right? So things can appear to exist externally, but not exist externally. Those things can cause results like suffering or happiness, even though they don't exist externally. And they would say the same thing is true in waking life. And then there's another point they make, which is a more subtle philosophical point that I just want to raise, is, let's see if I actually wrote it down, I want to phrase this correctly, but I don't think I wrote it down, but oh, here it is. I'll actually read the way I phrased it because I was trying to get it just right. It's tricky. A mountain in a dream is not your mind, but it isn't an external mountain. And therefore, it doesn't exist as a different substantial entity from your mind. Just so with all things. So what I'm getting at there, I just want to sort of get at that, just to explore that a little bit, because I think it's going to help us as we go forward. So this is like, I'm orienting us, if that makes sense. Is mind-only school is not saying everything is mind. Right? Not exactly. And so I'm using the example here, which comes from Buddhist texts, actually, of a dream mountain, right? And so the point that's easy to see is that a dream mountain doesn't exist as an external mountain. Everybody, if you wake up from a dream, you don't have to be a philosopher to realize that, right? You saw some mountain, you were trying to climb it, and you wake up and you go, wow, that wasn't, it was a dream. And there was no external mountain, right? But now it's getting at something subtler here, which is, so that the mountain in your dream is not mind, but it's not external. And it doesn't, and this is the important phrase here, it doesn't exist as an external entity from your mind, right? And what they're getting at here is, mind is that which is clear and known, right? So mind is not a mountain, right? So they're not saying the mountain in your dream is your mind, but they're saying it doesn't exist as anything separate from your mind, right? As a separate entity from your mind. Right? And that's true, isn't it? If you pause and think about a dream mountain, right? Or think about a person you met in your dream, right? A person you talked to in your dream, right? So that person who you dreamt about, right, in the dream, like if let's say they were doing something in relation to you, right? They don't, and the dream person does not exist as a separate entity from your mind, right? Because if they did, when you woke up, you should be able to find them, right? As something external to you, but you can't. And that's really, when this school presents it, they say, external forms are empty of existing as entities separate from mind. That's actually the precise sort of way they would say it, mind-only school. That's the, actually, then I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm not supposed to cover this yet. It's in the later section, but I just got at one of the forms of emptiness according to this school, right? Or things are empty of existing as external forms, or forms are empty of existing as entities separate from mind. Yeah. And actually, if you pause, I'm just going to share a few more personal reflections before I go on. One is, if you pause to think about that, one point is, if the Buddhist definition of an existent thing is that which is an object of experience, an object of perception, right? One point is, you start to see, oh, wow, this is a hard argument to argue against, in a sense, right? In other words, because if that which exists is that which is, can be perceived, and they're saying, and then if each experience of that thing is a moment of experience of a consciousness, right? In what sense do things exist as separate entities from the mind, right? It's not saying that, and the true, especially they're not saying things. So they're not saying things don't exist, right? They're not saying everything is mind exactly. They're saying things don't exist as separate entities from the mind. Is one point. It's a subtle distinction, but it's worth thinking about. And then there was another point I would make. Oh, this is just, I want to just raise a question to you now. This is not part of this. This is not directly part of it, but I think it's an interesting thing to understand the value of studying this. Like, those of you who have studied Madhyamaka are very familiar with the phrase, right? Merely labeled by the mind, right? Madhyamakas will say, things exist merely labeled by the mind, right? So I want to ask you, like, the word merely in that, now this is Madhyamaka, right? In Madhyamakas, they say things exist merely labeled by the mind, right? So what I want to ask you, just something to think about, is, does that which exists merely labeled by the mind exist external to the mind as a separate entity from the mind? Then what does merely mean in that sentence? And I'm just raising this to confuse you on purpose in a way, right? Because this is what a mind-only school philosopher might say, right? A mind-only philosopher might say, might say to a Madhyamaka, what are you talking about? If things exist, you're saying things exist in dependence upon the mind as merely labeled by the mind. Well, they don't exist as separate entities from the mind, then, right? They're not two separate entities, right? Everything is, and everybody's perception of the cup is individual to their perception, right? And so there's no there's no other cup than that. That's how the cup exists. And then there's another point I'll mention. These are just general orientation points. Also, this school takes, the mind-only school, is wonderful in another way, in the sense that it's also getting at karma. Because what they also say is, your experiences of things, right? These experiences of cup or of people or of your house or of whatever, arise in dependence upon the seeds of karma, right? And so dependent upon that karmic seed, there's a subject and an object that arise, right? You have this experience of consciousness, and you have experience of an external object. And this is getting at the false aspectarian, true aspectarian thing, right? like it's because of that karma. And to the extent that that karma is under the influence or tainted by ignorance, right, you perceive things as external, even though they're not, as external to the mind, right, as external objects. But they don't exist that way. That's the emptiness, right? And so what they would say is all your experiences arise due to the force of karmic seeds, right? And you or I or whoever, we, right, think things exist externally in the way they appear, right? But actually, if your house existed, it wasn't a result of a karma, right, causing your consciousness and that external appearance to arise, then the spider that lives in your house should perceive your house the same way you do. Right? But it has a different karma, and so it has a different appearance. Totally different, right? Radically different appearance. And so they would say, you know, all these appearances are dependent upon karma also, right? Are manifestations of karmic imprints that give rise to this. And because your karma was created under the influence of ignorance, you know, it gives rise to this appearance of external objects with these various characteristics and so on. But they don't exist that way. So anyway, those are some general orienting points. Pause to see. Yeah. Okay. So maybe I'll pause there for a moment. I mean, just on this, because then we're going to get into the 3 types of true aspectarians. There are 3 subtypes. But I'll pause there and see if there are questions about the definition or about these 2 general divisions. John has a comment or a question.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to something you've been talking a lot about and started at the very first sentence. So when they say does not accept external objects, we should not take that literally, in the sense that, because if you accept that no external objects exist, you're back into nihilism again. And I think what I heard you say is that that's not where they are, that it's based on appearances and perspectives and karma. That physical objects theoretically do exist, but maybe not the way we initially would perceive them. Is that what they mean there? Because at least the words are rather dictatorial. It's like, does not accept external objects. There's no qualifiers there.
They would say, I guess I think this, I want to make sure, you know, I'll do my best to say it the way they would say it. I'm not sure if I'll say it'd be perfect, but what they would say is, it's very interesting and it's subtle. They would say forms exist. And forms function. But forms don't exist as external objects. That they appear to be external objects due to the imprints of our ignorance. But so they I mean, in the sense that, so they would say, like, where it says do not accept external objects, I want to make a couple points. One is it doesn't say they don't accept objects. So they would say objects exist, but I don't accept that they're external to the mind. So they would say, you know, so from this school's perspective, where it says does not accept external objects, it would have to say they do accept objects. For example, I mentioned in the other definition from Geshe Sopa, other powered natures, which we're going to get into. So they would accept there are such things as other powered natures, as functioning things that exist and that function and that perform their unique functions. But what they would say is those things do not exist as external objects. They exist, they don't exist as separate entities from consciousness. So that would be, so you can take literally do not accept external objects, but you don't take from that they don't accept objects. They would say objects do exist. They just don't exist as separate entities from the mind.
Okay, right. So again, I was taking it, I guess, literally the way I was at least reading it. So they would not say the object, the cup, taking your example, the cup, it's white, not gray, but the cup does physically exist, but it doesn't exist independent or in any substantive manner, so to speak, I guess.
It's an interesting question you're raising. Like, I don't know. One thing is, like you said, the only word I wondered about is you said physically. Like, so they would say the cup is white, the cup exists, the cup can function to hold water. I wonder though, if you asked a mind-only philosopher, does it exist physically? Actually, I'll say it made me think of something. With like, I remember this once. I often mention my very close friend. He went to his teacher and he was having a lot of physical pain, and he went to his teacher and he said, like, I'm having a hard time meditating. My body's in so much pain that I can't meditate well. And his teacher said, your body is just a concept. Which was, I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I don't know if he was saying that from, I'm not sure which philosophical position his teacher was talking from, but this school would say your body doesn't exist as a separate entity from consciousness. The cup doesn't exist as a separate entity from consciousness. Your house doesn't exist as a separate entity from consciousness. But your body still can experience pain. The cup can still hold water. The house is still something you can live in. So it's subtle, isn't it? So I was sort of contemplating your choice of the word physical. I was like, oh, would they agree with that or not? I've never, I don't know. I've never heard that asked directly from a mind-only perspective. I would challenge the word physical. They might not say physical. They might just say the cup exists. But I'm not sure they would say the cup physically.
It was not a question of how it exists per se, but it does exist.
Yeah, so they would say objects exist. Yeah, other powered natures, meaning objects. So other powered are things that arise due to causes and conditions. So from this school's perspective, objects that arise due to causes and conditions, like cups, exist, but they don't exist as external objects.
Okay.
Yeah, and their point would be partly, like, there are many arguments, but one would be because if it exists as an external object, then every being that perceived it would have to perceive it the same way. But that's not the case. And, so on.
Thank you.
Lynn has a comment.
Maybe John's question it seems like for something to be an external object, it has to have a definition, and the definition is not the same definition for each perceiver. So when you held up your cup, I saw a blue cup. I didn't see a silver cup, right? So I saw a different, right? So I guess the mind-only school would say that cup is not a particular color. It's in the mind of the perceiver. So it doesn't exist as an external object. It exists in our mind perceiving. Yeah.
Yeah, that's reasonable.
And then the other thing I thought of, and I mean, I don't know if this is true, but it seems like the difference between the true and the false aspectarian is almost a matter of perspective. It's like the true believes that what that person sees actually exists, and the false one says, no, that's that particular mind engaging with that particular object. Almost like you're backing up watching the person perceive it.
Well, and I'll just point out something related to that, which is one reason, one significance, I guess, of that question of is there something untainted by ignorance in the perception of a cup or a tree or a house, or that plays out if you play it forward in terms of Buddhism and Buddhist thought, is if one philosophical issue they start to raise is this, is if the false expectations are correct, right, that all conventional appearances are tainted by ignorance, then how about a Buddha? The Buddha has no, and so you might say, well, does a Buddha have taints of ignorance? And if not, then can a Buddha not perceive a cup? How's the Buddha omniscient? The Buddha's omniscient, but they can't even see a cup? What do you mean? Like, how's that omniscient then? They can't, the Buddha can't see a tree, but if all external, if all, so it's a philosophical debate that starts to get into, as you progress on the path and you get rid of the taints of ignorance, don't you still see, to benefit others, if you have to give somebody a cup sometimes, or you have to see the person suffering in order to help them. But can a Buddha not see somebody suffering? Or are all appearances of conventionalities tainted by ignorance? Then how does a Buddha perceive things in order to help others? It's a philosophical question that these false expectarians and true expectarians are raising on the level of ordinary people, but it has implications. And so then some mind-only philosophers will say that many conventional appearances are tainted by ignorance, but not all. Or that there's a way in which things can appear conventionally that's untainted by ignorance. But it's an important question, because how does, if you can't present a view that that there's a way conventionalities can appear that's not tainted by ignorance, then how does a Buddha, then you have the problem of how does the Buddha interacted with people, right? He went around and taught. Obviously he saw, he didn't trip, he saw where he was going, whatever, I'm being silly, but so there are implications to that also, that play out if you take them philosophically and sort of play them forward. These true aspectarian and false aspectarian questions about, do conventional appearances always rely on ignorance, have implications for later on the path also. I don't know if Lynn had more, or then Cynthia.
Oh, Dr. Arn, so how would they explain that more than, if there's two people calling the cup a cup, that that still depends, or that does not exist as an outside of the mind? Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah.
So how would they explain that then?
What they say, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I kind of, that there's still two people can think of the cup, first of all, as a cup, and that there is some common function, that it can hold something, or if that makes sense, or it can feel something. So are they saying that then that does not exist as such, as that there's a function? And how would they define then? I think this might be a topic later, but I have this question, that then how would they define a valid cognizer if they have that kind of definition? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think you're raising interesting points. I want to just, I'll address the first part of your question. I'm going to really try to address it from their perspective for a moment. Like, so what they would say is common appearances to different individuals' awareness or consciousnesses would come from shared latencies, or shared karmic latencies. And here would be an example of their argument on that. Right? They would say, well, so let's say yeah, just yesterday I used like what was that? It was like not a cup, a bowl to catch a insect, right? And so they would say like, the humans who live in this house have a similar karmic latency, right? So when they look at that, they look and say that's a bowl, and they can talk about a bowl. Whereas the insect had a totally different appearance of that because it has a different karmic latency. For it, there was a trap or some kind of something that was blocking it, and then stuck it in the darkness, and then took it outside, whatever. Then it was suddenly on a leaf, and and so it had a totally different karmic appearance of that. So they would say certain beings have similar karmic, you could say similar karmic seeds, and so for them, there's a kind of temporary similar appearance of, and so, but it's still not identical, right? Like, so if say two, so they would say, one person might think, so for one person, it's like, that's, a nice bowl. And for somebody else, that's kind of a junky bowl. And that's why I use it for catching insects. I don't really like it, something, but then for the insect, it has a totally different appearance, and for a different other kind of creature, it would have a different appearance. And they give the example in this school of, actually, and there's a traditional example that gets at this point, actually, and according to the mind-only school, that's often used, where they talk about a bowl of water. And they say, if you have a bowl of water, then for human beings, when they perceive it, humans have a certain kind of karma. So when they see that, there's a common label, bowl of water. They'll all talk about a bowl of water. And they say, but if you put that same, if a hungry ghost comes to that same place, it will see a bowl of pus. And then they say, and if a god from the god realm comes, it'll see like a chalice of nectar or something. And they say, like, beings in the god realm, if a group of god realm beings came there, they have a similar karma. So they'll perceive chalices of, they'll all talk about, oh, do you want the chalice of nectar? No, I'll have the chalice of nectar. If human beings are there, they'll say, oh, it's bowl of water, are you thirsty? Or let's water the plant or something. And then a hungry ghost will come there, they'll say, oh, it's pus and I'm so thirsty and I can't drink it. It's, like that. And so they would use that. So they would say those beings of different realms have different kinds of, like each each group of beings has similar karmic tendencies, but then the beings in the other realm have their own similar ones. And so the things appear differently to different kinds of beings. And so they would say that's, and whether you use the more like the everyday example of the bowl, that the insect appears differently, or this is a more traditional Buddhist example, the point they're getting at is that it's because of the similarity of the karmic tendencies or karmic seeds or karmic latency that certain groups of beings can perceive something. And even actually, you think about it, like, I was thinking of this the other day where I was like, oh, wow, like, even like I was actually, well, the other day I was thinking about same different examples. I'll say, I don't want to use the hackney, so I'll say like take the example of Stalin, right? Like so there were a group of people in Russia who, like, when they looked at him, they had this appearance of like, he's the savior, he's the great leader, he's this wonderful, right? And like, there was a certain aspect that appeared to that group of people's minds. Whereas now, like if I or somebody with similar background to me looks at him, they think, oh, wow, he was like a mass murderer, horrible mass murderer. And you just see his face and you immediately have this feeling of like, oh, he's this like person who killed millions of people, And the point is like, it depends on the group karma of those. So like, that's what they're saying is that, whether, and if you're of a different realm, it's even more different. If you're from a different time or a different subculture or some, there are ways in which certain things appear to you. But then if you're from a different time or a different realm or a different culture, then it appears differently. And so they're just saying, like, so it depends on many factors. The main one is karma, but that things appear. So, but they would say, but that's still the proof. There can't be, in other words, if Stalin existed one way, then everybody would always perceive Stalin the same way. if he were really a great leader, everybody would perceive him as a great leader. Nobody would look at him and think, oh, he's a terrible sociopath. Or if the bowl of water were really a bowl of water, then everyone would perceive it and say, oh, that's a bowl of water, but hungry ghosts don't see that, and so on. Or if the bowl really a bowl, then the insect that was captured by it would say, oh, great, here's a bowl. Like, let me fill it with some Cheerios or something. But the insect doesn't experience it that way. So what they would say is the similarity depends on group karma or similar karmic tendencies. And then when the similar karma runs out, then the beings no longer perceive that similarly. Also, suddenly they'll perceive, then if I die and get reborn as an insect, then maybe the next week Shayla will be catching me with a bowl and carrying me outside or something. Then I'll perceive it totally differently because I won't have that human karmic tendency anymore. So then my mental continuum would perceive that object totally different way. So it's just because of this temporary karma and this kind of set of karmic latencies and the human latencies that I perceive it a certain way, but that's only as long as I'm in this karmic pattern or something, or the set of karmas are ripening. So that's how they would answer that. And then I guess about your other point, I'll just say briefly, we'll get into, actually, there's a whole thing, there's a whole section here on, I think on, valid cognizes not valid. So maybe I'll wait till there because there's a whole section on ways of asserting object possessors where it gets into the questions of valid cognition. So maybe I'll wait and we'll get into that in detail there. But actually, I'll just pause there. It's really, when you think about those examples, like the bowl of water, or how different people perceive a cup, or how people perceive, a polarizing figure, you can see the power of that argument, actually, can you? Like, in other words, to be honest, I started with it was like, wow, you look at, I was actually laughing, I was thinking of how people see certain politicians now in America, right? So differently, and it's like, it's karma. It's there, it's like, depending on different karma, you perceive it in a radically different way. And and this goes saying, if there were an external object, everybody would perceive things similar, the same, but they don't, and whether it's a cup of water or whether it's a political figure or whether it's a, all different things, but the fact that beings' perceptions are so different is one of the proofs they use in this school to say things therefore don't exist independent of mind, and it depends on your karma. Yeah. Other points before I go on to the next. Oh, Kalsmi Varahi, yeah.
Yeah, how would a true aspectarian explain what Lynn was saying, that you saw a gray cup when you picked it up, and she actually saw a blue one? If they were to say that there's true aspects. I mean, I understand the latencies of ignorance from the point of view of truly established, but how would they explain the actual perception, the difference then? Because are they saying that form and color, there is something true about it, or?
Yeah. So I guess they would say, I believe they would say, like they might say, well, if it's probably, whatever, in ancient India, they would have said, oh, it's maybe the eye consciousness of the light or something, but you might say, some combination of it's a clear sky, so the blue is maybe this is kind of metallic. So they might say, well, this blue from the sky that's reflecting off it, and then Zoom doesn't have the best, perfect, but if next time I see Lynn in person, if I show her carefully, she'll say, oh yeah, it is gray, or so, without, like in a room where there's different kind of lighting or something, whatever, and it's in person where it's not over, so they would sort of say though that, that you could eventually come to a common understanding, like that, in other words, that if, that there could be differences in terms of, like lighting or image quality, but that eventually one could come to a common understanding. Like, oh yeah, it's gray, but I can see how it could look blue because of different factors. It's, it's a kind of certain shade of, it's also slate gray, which is close to blue. And, but so in other words, that through like that, eventually the people could come to that common gross, what I was calling earlier, the gross aspect, where it would be shared. So they would say, and that then it will be a valid cognition of the color or something. And then until then, it's, a person could have like, because all the schools would say there's a possibility of, because of different, factors like lighting or other things, movement or different things, that there could be a mistaken or an inaccurate perception, but then it's possible to come to a common. Whereas the false aspectarians would say, they would actually be less interested in that, wouldn't they? They would just say, well, yours is a perception, hers is a perception. There is no common, so it'd be a difference of, it would be a different approach in a way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, maybe, yeah, there's still time. So maybe it's good to cover the, at least part of this thing. So next section is the 3 types of true aspectarians, right? So we covered what the true aspectarians are, right? That they say they're aspects of direct perception of conventional objects that are not polluted by the latencies of ignorance. And so now there are 3 types of those, 3 subtypes. Proponents of an equal number of apprehendeds and apprehenders, half-egists, and non-pluralists. And obviously these are translations into English of terms from Sanskrit that were translated and it's Tibetan and now into English. So it says each has their own individual assertions. So it is said that proponents of an equal number of apprehendeds and apprehenders assert that when an eye consciousness apprehending the model colors on the wing of a butterfly apprehends the model, from the object side, the aspect of each different color, blue, yellow, and so on, is delivered. And also from the subject side, the aspect of each different color, blue, yellow, and so on, is produced in its true aspect. I'll pause. So this is first of all, the name of this group implies what the group is, right? Proponents of an equal number of apprehendeds and apprehenders. What they're getting at, what these 3 points in a way are getting at, is an issue of perception, right? An aspect, the aspect in which things arise, and so on. And so they're talking about the wings of a butterfly, but actually, I was thinking about. I was having the experience because I've been thinking about this. Think about this Zoom meeting, right? So when you join a Zoom meeting with however many people this is, right? It's getting at one. This school would say, so in other words, there are various individuals, right, on the Zoom call. So this school would say, well, maybe I'll step back. What this is asking is, how do you perceive that, right? Whether it's the many colors on the wing of a butterfly or the many faces on the Zoom call and the backgrounds of each, right? Everybody's has a different background too. How do you perceive that? How does the mind experience that? And oops. So the proponents of an equal number of apprehendeds and apprehenders, right, is saying there are as many consciousness apprehending as there are things to be apprehended. And where's Geshe Sopa? So I'll read, I'm just going to read different, it's getting at the same point, but basically what they're saying, maybe I don't need to read it, but is that, I'll read, actually, this is a more straightforward one. Proponents of an equal number of subjects and objects, that's another way of saying the same thing, are so called because they assert that just as the blue and yellow, which appear to a sense consciousness apprehending the wings of a butterfly, are different substantial entities, so within the I consciousness apprehending the model, there are many I consciousnesses that are different substantial entities. So what they're saying is, as many things, like since blue and yellow are different substantial entities, they're not one color, they're different colors, that there has to be different subjects perceiving them. Does that make sense? So there's one part of the I, actually not one part, you'd say there's one I consciousness perceiving blueness, there's another I consciousness perceiving yellowness, there's another I consciousness perceiving redness, or if on the Zoom call, you would say there's a different I consciousness perceiving Phyllis versus Sujata versus John versus Jody and so on. So they're saying for as many objects perceived, there have to be that many perceivers. And some of these proponents of equal number of subjects and objects, or of apprehended and apprehenders, some of them say those apprehendeds and apprehenders arise simultaneously. Others say they arise serially. Right? That you'd first see one and then another, but it happens very quickly. Whereas others say they're simultaneous. It's just different positions of these philosophers. But you get the idea. So what they're getting at is that each entity that's perceived, or each color that's perceived, each aspect, each detail that's perceived has to have a apprehender or a subject perceiving it. I'm just going to pause for a second just to say, actually, I guess Silgo, who was another of my teachers, was reading his commentary, and he said, again, he was doing this thing of check your own perception. In other words, he was making a point. If you see something that's like multicolored, like say a multicolored blanket or a butterfly or whatever, like, is there a perception of just a general model of colors? Or in the first instant, do you perceive each color specifically? Or do you perceive kind of a general model and then you can focus? Oh, look, there's blue, there's this, there's that, right? It's getting at this, these different sub-schools are getting at how do you perceive multiplicity? Does that make sense? So anyway, this sub-school is saying there's many subjects as there are objects of perception. Many consciousnesses, or apprehenders as there are things that are apprehended. The half-egists have a different argument, a different position. I'll read what the text actually said. It is said that the half-egists assert that when such is apprehended, meaning like the wings of a butterfly, from the object side, the aspect of each different color, blue, yellow, and so on, is delivered. However, from the subject side, the aspect of each different color, blue, yellow, and so on, is produced in an aspectless manner. And what they're really saying, I think that's hard to understand, so I'll just say what they're really getting at is that there are not many consciousnesses, as the previous ones was saying, that there's one consciousness perceiving, but it perceives a kind of just a general model, a general mix, or a general sort of aspectless, where it's saying, how do they say in this translation? Aspectless manner. What they're saying is that you don't perceive the details initially. You just perceive a kind of general impression of sort of multiplicity there. That's kind of a model of things. And they're like, and this is what Geshe Silgo was getting at. And then if you pause and you want to look at one thing, you can perceive that. Then another, you can perceive that. But when there are many, so like when you first got on the Zoom call, you used to perceive, oh, I'm on a Zoom call. There's a group there. And then that'll be the half-egist position. It's sort of a vague perception. And then if you focus in, oh, look, there's Varahi. Oh, look, there's Cynthia, whatever, you could sort of focus in on individuals, but at first there's just this kind of general vague model of things. But they're asserting that there's one consciousness, not many. And then as the non-pluralist name implies, they're also going to suggest there's one consciousness. So it is said that non-pluralists assert that when such, meaning like the wings of a butterfly in this example, is apprehended from the object side, the aspect of each different color, blue, yellow, and so on, is not delivered, but rather the aspect of a mere conglomeration is delivered. From the subject side, the aspect of each different color, blue, yellow, and so on, is not produced in an aspectless manner, but rather the aspect of the mere conglomeration is produced in an aspectless manner. And let me just pull this up. Oh. So here I'm going to use Geshe Choni's commentary. So the half-egists and the non-pluralists are similar in asserting that there is only one consciousness generated when perceiving a group of things. So this is the way he presents it, with the way he explains what was just said. What he says is, for the half-egists and the non-pluralists agree that when there's a kind of multiplicity or something that's presented like wings of a butterfly with many colors, or Zoom call with many people, or you go into a crowd, whatever, they differ from the proponents of an equal number of apprehended and apprehenders in the sense that that first group would say there are many consciousnesses perceiving each individual thing. The half-egists and non-pluralists agree with each other that there's only one consciousness. But here's the difference, and I'll just read his words. For the half-egists, from the side of the subject, the consciousness is generated in the aspect of apprehending the general model, not apprehending the aspects of the various colors that make up the model. Right? That was what I just said. So they're sort of perceiving this just sort of vague general model. Whereas for the non-pluralist, he says, the model on the wing of a butterfly, different aspects are cast, but only one consciousness is being generated into those aspects. So they're saying that those different colors are kind of there in the perception. It's not just a kind of vague model. And that the consciousness may not, what's the word? May not be able to differentiate all those things, but they're all there in a way. All the different colors are there already. It's not just a kind of vague general thing. Yeah, so he says it again. So he says the different aspects are cast, but only one consciousness is being generated into those aspects. So it's a single consciousness that's generated into that. That's his position on what the non-pluralists are saying. I'll just say another point here. Geshe Sopa, who's wonderful, says on this topic, he presents, actually in his text, he goes through a commentary where he presents different Buddhist philosophers, Jamyang Shepa and Panchen Sonam Drakpa. Anyway, he goes through different philosophers, different positions, and he basically says there are slight differences actually in what different some different philosophers say the differences are between these sub-schools. Yeah, so, and I wanted to just share one part of those because that was interesting, is there are a few points that I'll just mention very briefly. I don't think we need to go into a huge amount of detail about this because I don't think people remember necessarily, but I'll just say one point that Geshe Sopa mentions in two different places is about the half-egists. He uses the half-egists as the example here. And he says, one point he says is that the half-egists are called that, he gives two different reasons. He says, basically he says they're called that, he gives two different philosophers give two different reasons. He said, one says, why are they called half-egists, basically? And he says, because they're half like Sautantrikas and half like mind only. And then another philosopher says they're called that because half-egists are so called because they assert that although blue and the icons apprehending in blue are serial in terms of time, they are one substantial entity. So what he's getting at they're similar. I want to get at what this is saying though, because I just think it's kind of interesting, is he's saying they're similar to Sautantrikas in what sense? For a Sautantrika, right, which we studied previously, there's an object out there, right? and this I just think is interesting to get at the general idea of mind only. That's why I'm focusing on it for a moment. Sautantrikas say, right, external objects exist from their own side and perform functions from their own side. And so for a Sautantrika, when you perceive something, right, the object is already out there and it casts its aspect onto, say, I'm using the example of vision, right? It casts its aspect onto your eye consciousness, right? And then your eye consciousness takes on the aspect of that object, partly depends upon numerous things, right? The external object existing from its side, the eye sense power, the eye organ, the eye sense power existing from its side, right? Then the eye consciousness being present, and then contact between the external object and the eye, right? And the eye consciousness. All those have to come together. And then there's an experience of shape and color. That makes sense, right? From the Sautantrika's perspective. What this is getting at, though, is, well, mind-only school doesn't, in general, doesn't assert there are external objects, right? So what would it mean? How could you say there's an external thing out there that's going to cast this aspect onto an eye sense power and then an eye organ, right? It's raising an interesting point. I just want to point that out, right? And so what he's saying here, what Geshe Sopa is saying, is the have-egists are trying to have it in a way half like the Sautantrika and half like the mind only, in the sense that they're saying, well, in other words, things arise due to karma, right? According to this school. So what this school is saying as well, the have-egists, according to the way this particular philosopher is saying it, is they kind of like the karma first produces appearance, the external, the aspect of the, the karmic latency or karmic seed first produces an an object in a way, and then produces an experience, a perception of that object, right? So it's a little like the Sautantrikas in a sense. And then what Geshe Sopa says is, well, actually, it doesn't quite make sense, does it? Essentially, in other words, because there is no external object according to this school. And so, what he kind of argues in essence, I'm not going to go into all the details, is it has to be simultaneous, right? In other words, that since there is no external object, Geshe Sopa is saying that these different sub-schools of the true and false aspectarians are really have to get at, that the karmic seed has to produce both simultaneously, doesn't it? So in other words, that it's going to produce an appearance of something external that's not actually external, which means if it's an appearance, there's a consciousness already perceiving it, right? And there is nothing that exists as a separate entity from that consciousness in that, right? That's being perceived. So anyway, so the have-egists are kind of are saying, and so here one philosopher says, the have-egists is so called because they assert that although blue and the eye consciously apprehending blue are serial in terms of the time of their coming into existence, they are one substantial entity in terms of the time of their observation. And then Geshe Sopa says, they maintain that the object exists before and helps to produce the perceiving consciousness. But they hold that at the same time, the object is observed by the eye consciousness. The eye consciousness is observed by a self-cognizing consciousness. Anyway, so there are different positions, but what he basically is saying, in brief, he's saying, since things are, that for the most part, the easiest, I guess you'd say it this way, the easiest position to uphold for a mind-only philosopher would be that it's simultaneous, that those things should be simultaneous. Beyond that, I'm not sure, beyond that, I'll just say one last comment on that and then I'll finish this section. I just think I guess I'll just say this. I don't think we need to go into detail. You guys don't, I don't think you remember all the details of these different sub-schools of the sub-school, but I think the useful part here to think about is just to look at your own perception. Maybe that, each time I try to suggest like a homework to think about. So I'll suggest two. It's just something to contemplate. One is, so I'll suggest two homeworks to think about. One is, if people's perceptions are different and animals, not just people, if beings' perceptions are different, is there a sense in which, or to really think about that argument from the mind-only school, that's the core one I would suggest, is right, like, if everybody's perceptions are different, and even your own perceptions are different over time, then do things exist as separate substantial entities from mind? That's one. And the other, if you want to, that's more detailed from this section, would be when you look at a group of things, just to notice, how do I perceive that group? You may, the first time I studied this, I realized I'd never even asked myself that before. Actually, another thing I never asked myself is, what does external mean? I say no external object, right? These are different things you could ask, right? What does it mean to be external? What does that word mean? Like, cup seems to be external, but what does that actually mean that it's external? So that's one. Another one would be, how do I perceive a group of things? And is there a general model and a general sort of splash of something there, and then I can sort of focus in on one or another? Or do I perceive all of it in each instant? It's just, they're asking, these philosophers are asking those questions, but the usefulness of it, I think, for us, is to check your own perception, to check your own experience. So that's that.
Lauren, can I ask you to repeat the first one that you just said?
The first contemplation.
The first contemplation.
The first contemplation I said, which I think is really the key one, the core one for this school up to this point, is to check, right? If it's true, which one discovers it is, right? That different beings really do perceive differently, right? Then, and if even I, so for oneself, right? First of all, different different humans perceive differently. Then humans and non-humans perceive even more differently. Then even I, over time, can perceive differently, right? Then to evaluate this school's assertion. So is there a sense in which, do things exist as separate entities from mind then? And how can I assert that? That's really the core question, right? So if beings perceive differently, then do things exist as a separate entity from mind? And if so, how can I assert that? How can I personally argue that things exist as separate entities from mind? If they're perceived differently by different beings, and even by myself over time. I think that's the contemplation. I think that's really worthwhile, isn't it? An interesting one. Yeah. Lynn has a comment.
It seems like, at least for me, my mind sees things that are important to me or that are necessary. And I had this experience. I used to work a long time ago in Louisiana with sharecroppers or farm workers, and they were all Black, all African American. And I had to arrange a meeting in a church, and they told me where to go to arrange the meeting. And I arranged it. And then I went back to the two people I was working with, and I said, I think I got the right person, the pastor. And they said, well, is he white or Black? And I said, I don't remember. And they started laughing, and they said, if you were us, you'd remember, because they were both Black, and they had to remember these things, right? But I didn't, that's not a factor I felt was necessary to take in at the time, because I'm a privileged white person, and I was then. So it was like, it's like what I saw was different than what they saw in person. And then I realized that you go around in the world and you see what you have to see for your existence to survive in the world. And they had to see who was Black and who was white, whereas I didn't necessarily have to do that. So it's the same person, it's just how we saw the person.
Well, and actually, what the mind only school would challenge, I guess, is not even to disagree, but what I would challenge is even like, so you said it's the same person, but, and the question would be, in what sense is it the same person?
It's the person that opened up the church for us.
But I guess like what I'm asking is more like so that person who opened the church is that person's own perception of themselves the correct one, or is your perception the correct one, or is the two people you spoke to, each of theirs, is one of theirs the correct one? Which is the correct perception of who that person is? Or is there some person that exists independent of all those that's the correct person, that exists out there somewhere that's independent of all those, that's the actual correct, same real person? Oh. And I'm just suggesting that that's part of what this school is asking. I'm not trying to answer that question. All I'm trying to say is that I think that's part of what this school is asking. Like, I think this school is making us have to contemplate questions like that. That's really all. I'm not trying to ask you to answer it right now or ask myself to answer it. But that this school is trying to make us pause and be with those kinds of questions. You know, and yeah, anyway. And then Sujata has something.
Right, it relates to my confusion about last week's homework assignment with regard to this ideas of like doubt tending towards the factual and doubt tending towards the non-factual. And I got myself tied in quite a few knots over what's factual. And it got even murkier with the dharma, but even on trying to do it on the both aspects, right? Like just in regular life. Right. And so my husband and I were playing with this. He was very good natured about it, but we were using the example of, Jason's never had an affair. Okay, let's start with that. Like, let's assume that that's the fact. You have to start with the assumption. How do you really know what's true? But, I have a doubt tending towards the factual. Let's say I assume Jason's probably never had an affair. Right. But I think I was getting really caught up in, so then when we put that playful example aside, it was interesting to play with these things that you're attached to what's true, what's not true. And it became very, very murky about, so let's take an easier example. My favorite mug it was probably made by this person, Kimi Masui, right? I don't know, I struggled a lot with whether or not my doubt tended towards the factual or the non-factual, because I don't know what any of these facts are in real life. So I think that made the entire exercise really challenging for me. And I think that relates to some of the confusion I'm having about what we're talking about right now as well. So I don't know, any advice on that one, right? It's like, is it blue? Is it gray? I get caught in this quagmire a lot. Like, how do we know? And then maybe we both call the thing blue, but we're seeing completely different things. And that's another layer of confusion that I add to everything. So I don't know, any advice on how to go through both last week's and this week's assignments with regard to the factual? I think that I always just ended up in this place of accepting it because the Dalai Lama says so. I'm like, well, let's just assume, that things are, inherently lacking inherent existence because they're dependently originated. And we're going to start with that as the fact that I'm going to work with for this entire assignment because the Dalai Lama said so, but I don't have any direct experience of that. Right. So, yeah, I don't know if this question is making any sense at all, but it kind of muddles all the homework assignments for me that I can't, I've just been trying everything. I've been like walking around the state of like, this is my toothbrush. Like, and I'm like holding it, being like, well, let's hang on to this fact for a second here or something. But then my mind starts playing all these games. I'm like, well, okay, whatever. I won't go any further down this rabbit hole.
it's really like, first, I think it's great. Like to get, one thing I want to say a couple of points. One is I think it's really wonderful, right? To come, like, to be asking the question in a way that, where you start to realize in your own experience the things you're not, that you don't have, what's the word? Incontrovertible, valid cognition, right? Of like, is interesting experience. And then what this, I guess what both of these schools, if you think of like, because we're getting as reasoning, right? That's what that is about, right? It's like, well, actually I'll say, so there are two different, I guess I'll say it this way. If you think from a Buddhist perspective, what Buddhism is saying here, and what Dharma, you're thinking like Dharmakirti is saying, is really there are only two places, I think there are just two places you can start. One is in the present moment, direct cognition of something, right? So like, in other words, like, so if I say, like, I'm having the, like right this moment, I'm having the experience of holding a pen. Like that, I have no doubt. Is there really a pen there is a different question. Is there a real me there is a different question. But like that I'm having the experience of holding a pen, that I have no doubt in a sense. You know, if I start to ask what's the nature of that experience, then I might have doubt. Suddenly doubt might come, right? But, you know, if I just as you did that, I said, like, did I just have the experience of Sujata nodding her head? Like my eye consciousness had that experience. That's clear. Like, you know, now is there if I start to ask a different question, which is like, I don't know, is there a delayed recording or is there some other, you know, that's a different question, but that I had that experience is clear. There's no doubt. So one point is like direct, you know, I heard this, I saw this, you know, like in some of the sutras, right? Thus I have heard. Like there is the person saying, I heard this. That's a different question than is it true or did I understand it? But they can say, they can say without any doubt, I heard, you know, if I heard a loud sound, then I heard the loud sound. Now, was it, there's a different question, right? Was it a firework or was it a gunshot or that's a different question, but like that my ear consciousness experienced something. So that's one point, is direct valid cognition can be an example of something about which one can move beyond doubt. And then the second type of thing that allows one to move beyond doubt is inferential valid cognition, right? If you think from that school, from the Buddhist perspective. And so that is like, and I want to give an example, going back to your example that you just gave, Sujata, like, you know, the question of like, is the Dalai Lama correct that because all things are dependently arisen, they lack intrinsic nature? Going back to the ways, like in the teaching on that we did last time, there's a requirement that comes before that, which because I actually think that one's, there's something that's required before we can even get there, which is like through reasoning, you can come to an example, like, what's an example of this? Like, I can do this one. Like, is this pen a dependent arising? Not does it exist intrinsically, not like, in other words, I don't have a direct perception of is this pen a dependent arising. My eye consciousness or ear consciousness or tactile consciousness can't discern that. But that I can, like, if I look at this pen and contemplate through reasoning, I can say, well, it's got parts. Those parts definitely came together. I can take them apart and I can put them back together. I have no doubt, like, in other words, there's no doubt that it's a dependent arising. And even if like 500 scholars came and tried to say it's not a dependent arising, I would say, no, I know incontrovertibly that the pen is dependent arising. And that's something I can know through reasoning, so it's incontrovertible. And those are, and I guess my point is, like, if you look back to what we were covering last time, those are the only two ways to come to incontrovertible valid cognition, right? Like an incontrovertible knowing of something. And so I think you're raising an interesting question, which is like, what there are, you know, if you go back to these kinds of questions one's asking, to go back and say, well, can I know this through direct valid cognition? Or can I know it through inferential valid cognition? And there are certain things which one can, right? Is this pen a dependent arising? That I can know, right? Or is, I'm looking out the window, I can say, are leaves impermanent? Like, that's something I can know through inferential valid cognition. But what you're getting at in a way is that one comes to a point where one says, there are other things, there are many things which one can't know through either of those at this point, right? Maybe a Buddha can know them through direct perception, for example. But there are many points, right? Like so, for example, I'll give an example. Is Sujata actually, you know, from my perspective, or actually, well, since I'm talking to Sujata, I'll say, is John Ganzi a sentient being, or is he a Buddha manifesting as a sentient being to benefit others, right? And that I can't know through direct, I'm not a Buddha, so I can't know it through direct valid cognition, and I'm not capable of reasoning that out. There's no, like, in other words, I can sort of know now, like, that's a question I can't come to through inferential valid cognition. So for me, that's unknowable, actually, in terms of right now. And maybe someday when I'm a Buddha, I can know that. But for now, if I can make a decision, I'm going to relate to John as a very nice sentient being. But can I say I know for certain he's not a Buddha? I can't know that, right? Like, and so, like, there are many things that, I'm just giving an example, but there are many, many things then that for me are not, I can't come to a valid cognition of. But then but actually, and what Buddhism is saying, and actually, if you look at like the texts of Dharmakirti, I guess I'm a sec, but one thing that's really interesting is what Dharmakirti in his it's supposed to be the Pramana Vartika. What he says is that he doesn't say it this way, but he in essence is saying, when it comes to the really important points about Dharma practice, those are things that can be known through direct valid cognition or inferential valid cognition. He says, like, you know, because there are many other things that cannot be known in those ways. You know, there are many questions, right? Like, you know, that I personally can't know. Like, you know, was a famous painting by Van Gogh actually painted by Van Gogh? I don't know. Like, I don't know that. You know, but what he's saying is, are things impermanent can be known. You know, you know, the questions of suffering and of the cause of suffering, the path to the cessation of suffering. He says those things can be known by inferential valid cognition. But I think what you're getting at is a humility of recognizing that there are many other things that I can come to a belief about, or I can come to an opinion about, or I can come to even like a, you know, but that I can't ultimately be certain of. But then there are many other things that can be known through inferential valid cognition in particular. And that's what that whole teaching is really emphasizing, is recognizing what are these important things that I can know through inferential valid cognition. Anyway. We should probably stop there. But so, okay, we got up to the, we covered almost the whole section of the divisions. No, that's where we left off. And I think it's in 2 weeks we have the next class. And so, you know, just continue on. Let's do our dedication. The supreme jewel bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In this snowy mountain paradise, you, the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Oh, and I'll just mention briefly, Gabe did a great job. So first of all, I put a bunch more dates on the calendar through September, I think it is, of classes. So just so people can, since people, you know, it's useful to be able to know. So, and Gabe posted them already to the website, so they're up there. And then also, just yesterday, Gabe did a great job posting also about another event on August 15th that actually Sujata is one of the speakers, will be one of the speakers at, and we have other, Adi Tendril will be a speaker as well. There are other speakers, but about an anti-racism event related to racism in the US against people of Asian descent. That's the accurate way to describe it. So I don't know if there's a more detailed way to present it, but it should be a beautiful event. So I just wanted to mention that everybody's welcome. And about 15 or 16 centers are co-sponsoring it, which is wonderful. So it's like, I think it's the first event of that type for FPMT that I'm aware of in North America. So not all, but many FPMT centers and non-FPMT also, but it's quite, so I'm happy about that. But also, so that's coming up, and also the event, these classes are also posted there, and all that's on the website. So anyway, I look forward to seeing everybody in a couple of weeks. And yeah, the Mind Only School is really interesting though, I think. So it'll be a fun exploration of the Mind Only School. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.